Bought and returned it, thanks for understanding, Steam, and I will rebuy it if and only if the dev takes the couple hours of effort to add 21:9 aspect ratio support. How can you consider this AAA without such a basic feature? 1 step forward, 2 steps back. I'll start by addressing the elephant in the room. You have 300 hours in the game, how can you not recommend it? Well, let me do a breakdown of how those hours were spent. 150 hours, duplicating progress in my own world for sections that I already did with a friend. 80 hours, riding around the open world and fighting copy-pasted enemies, exploring dungeons and fighting copy-pasted bosses and enemies. 40 hours, the actual fun part of the game, legacy dungeons. These areas follow the format of the previous Souls games and feature carefully crafted, closed-off areas with interesting enemies and well-designed bosses. 30 hours, arena PvP, invasions, co-op with randoms. So overall, that makes 70 hours of fun content, and 230 hours of filler. If you're planning to buy this game to play with a friend, be prepared for a 7:23 ratio of fun to filler content. Now, I'd like to get into my criticisms with the game itself. Open world. The open world is honestly really beautiful and engaging in the first 3 areas, Limgrave, Liurnia, and Caelid. You won't be able to explore it as intended on a horse while playing in multiplayer, but that's not a big deal. These first areas have a good amount of content packed into them, and you'll be seeing enemy varieties for the first time, so you won't be bored of them yet. The problem begins 1/3 of the way into the game, at Altus Plateau. This area is really beautiful as well, and probably my favorite visually, but you will start to notice some really empty areas and a lot of copy-pasted enemies in the open world. After you get through Leyndell, you arrive at the worst part of the game, the mountaintops of the giants. This area has, I think, one single new enemy that is not just copy-pasted from the previous areas with a different skin. It's not even worth the words to describe how bad this area is. If you buy the game despite my negative review, here's some advice: hop on your horse and ride straight to the boss, because there's nothing worth exploring here. Right after this is another empty snow area, but the devs use an innovative trick here. Most of the area is covered in a snowstorm. This expertly hides the areas that they didn't have time to finish, so you can't see how devoid of content they are. Multiplayer. First of all, the netcode for this game's multiplayer is absolute trash. Connecting to your friends fails or hangs about 10% of the time, and invading requires you to use the item 1 to 30 times before you'll successfully invade someone. As far as anyone can tell, FromSoft is basically still using the same netcode that they used back in Dark Souls in 2011, just with a couple of band-aids thrown on top to prevent infinite backstabs. Latency is a huge decider of every fight you will have, and a lot of the skill comes from being able to quickly identify the approximate ping difference between yourself and your opponent, and adapting your tactics accordingly. Your skills at PvE will not carry over at all. In PvE, you can look at an enemy's attack and decide to press dodge if you think it will hit you, but in PvP, you have to press dodge anyways no matter where their weapon is because of the invisible hitboxes and latency. On top of this, FromSoft decided to make the latency issues even more prominent by introducing powerful status effects that build up on you even if you successfully dodge an enemy attack. The top level of PvP is full of Scarlet Rot and Sleep status abusers who exploit the fact that these status effects build up on you even through dodges, and the counter for this is to duplicate items, cheating, which cure Rot/Sleep in the middle of combat. Oh, and if you want to turn their tactics around on them, then you'll need to duplicate items too, because the Sleep and Rot Grease are both limited in the quantity that you can obtain legitimately in a single playthrough. Watching a high-level invasion honestly makes me laugh with how many limited-use items both players are popping like candies. PvP is just laughably broken. On top of this, there are some multiplayer decisions made by the developers that cannot be described as anything other than stupid. First of all, co-op requires an item to even be allowed to summon people. In the early game, you'll have to waste some time farming for flowers, and probably 10 minutes trying to figure out why you can't summon, until you look it up. Next, if you kill a boss, you can't summon your friend anymore or be invaded in that area. If you kill all the bosses in a particular open world chunk, then that whole area is off limits for multiplayer. When you kill a boss anywhere in the world, even if it's just a random dragon in the open world, you will be sent home as a cooperator. There are random fog walls preventing you from entering caves with your friend, and you'll have to disconnect, ride to that spot in your own world, enter the cave in your own world, then reconnect to your friend. Logical, right? It obviously improves the gameplay. Finally, even when everything is working properly and the networking issues aren't getting in the way, Elden Ring co-op is just horribly balanced. After the first couple of early game bosses, every challenge in the game starts to become easy. Most enemies are simply not coded well to deal with multiple players attacking them. Bosses will change targets anytime they take damage, even if it's a tiny throwing knife, meaning that aggro juggling is incredibly easy. The bosses are supposed to be able to kill you by damaging you and then punishing you when you try to heal, but with aggro juggling, you will always be able to heal unless you mess up horribly and get killed in a single combo. This does happen, so co-oping bosses can still take a few tries, but the difference between multiplayer and single player is night and day. Despite the fact that the game increases enemies' health in co-op, the game is at least 3 times easier. To try to compensate for that, my friend and I turned on the taunter's tongue to attract invaders, but the game was still too easy, because it's incredibly hard for an invader to fairly beat 2 people. If you try invading, you will probably walk into a blender of 3 people spamming spells and ashes of wars and die in 0.5 seconds. This means that the only people who are left invading at higher levels, the only people who can manage to have fun within this framework, are the players who are willing to use any tactic necessary to win. Be prepared to deal with lots of duplicated rot grease, duplicated starlight shards, snipes from across the map with duplicated golem arrows, and nuke builds that can kill you if you make a single mistake. I don't even blame the players who are using these tactics, because without them, there would be no invaders at higher levels. The game is simply so broken that players are forced to resort to these tactics to have a greater than 0.5% chance of winning invasions. Story. The story is mostly incomprehensible if you rely solely on playing the game. You have to watch YouTube videos to have any idea of what's going on. After watching some, though, I came to this conclusion. Every one of the main players is a greedy heartsuit. George R.R. Martin tried to craft a complicated story, but the gameplay just doesn't support it. Imagine Game of Thrones, but there are no background civilians in the story. It's just the lords and ladies fighting over empty castles full of monsters. That's Elden Ring. Every single creature attacks you on sight, and there are no visible civilians. You are fighting to become the Lord of Ashes. Overall, the game is alright, but it's simply not a good way to spend your time. It all comes back to the 7:23 ratio of fun to filler. Maybe others will find that to be an acceptable ratio, but I don't. I wish I could get back the hours that I spent on this game, and I implore others not to make the same mistake that I did. Plain and simple. This is a very hard game. You will die, and die forevermore. If you're looking for a fun game, this is definitely not it. There's no in-game guides, very faint story, nothing great to collect or explore the world for. Almost every enemy you meet is a mini-boss. I've played over 10 hours and have hardly progressed in the game. I don't like games where you're stuck and not moving forward. Maybe I'll give this game another shot and change this review, but I'm tired of wasting hours and repeating the same defeats. I wanted to like the game, but it's too punishing to be fun. If you think you'd enjoy repeating dungeons half a dozen times until you memorize the fight mechanics of each pack of mobs so you can finally reach the boss with enough flasks to maybe stand a chance at beating it, you'll enjoy this game. I don't doubt there is a skill issue at play, but I don't have the will to practice until I'm good enough to play a game. I just wanted to run around killing things with magic and a sword. For fans of other RPG games such as Skyrim or Witcher, You might not enjoy this game unless you're looking for a punishing, trial-and-error combat system. I didn't get very far into the game, so perhaps the story gets better, but I wasn't sure if there was a narrative. The game tells you nothing. I didn't necessarily dislike the openness, or complete lack of direction, allowing you to choose your own path, but it becomes another punishing aspect of the game when you're walled off of areas by level without realizing and end up dead, again. Of course, you can wait to go back, but it gets very frustrating when this happens repeatedly, again with the trial and error. I'd have quit the game hours before I did had I not watched videos online to help, giving me vague directions or aims, but all they really did were delude me into thinking I could do it if I tried one more time or traveled to a different part of the map. And then, even after 1, or 3, more times, I felt no satisfaction from my victory because I realized every encounter in the game was going to be like this. To put it simply, the game required from me more time than I'm willing to give in order to get good. A lot of people seem to like that process. I don't, and if you don't, you won't like Elden Ring. I suspect I won't enjoy any of the Souls-like games, which is good to know. A lot of effort has been put into it, most people will not be disappointed and it blows other AAA games to shreds. However, I've played this on and off for the past few months and I think it's the reason why I don't think I found it enjoyable. The open world and the bosses are my biggest gripes. Whilst a lot of the main bosses are actually well thought out, I think that a lot of the optional bosses are rather bad. The problem of course is you have to traverse this open world and go off the beaten path to find these bad, copy-pasted optional bosses as you will be too underleveled to progress through the main story. I really did like Margot, who was a great boss, but the optional bosses I had to do and find in this immense world took a veritable age, and I didn't really have fun doing it. I have done perhaps 20 playthroughs of DS3 and the bits in between the bosses, I hated. However, the bits in between have become the majority of my playtime in this. Completing a lot of the bosses seems more of a chore than an enjoyable challenge, like homework to prepare for the final, actual boss. Another problem with the bosses, and I'm going to relate to Dark Souls Aegon, is that most bosses aren't unique. Obviously that can't be due to the scale of the game, but it's a valid criticism nonetheless. Whilst I can for example remember the themes for S and O or Gale's theme or Abyss Watcher. No doubt there are some less memorable bosses, but you get my point that bosses have left such a lasting impact on me compared to Elden Ring, where themes for different bosses in Elden Ring are copy and pasted. The copy and pasted bosses present another problem, that the bosses are sometimes not designed for a particular arena/fight. An example would be Misbegotten Warrior/Crucible Knight, tightly spaced duo with tons of props that get in the way, making the fight extremely claustrophobic and unpleasant. Obviously all the bosses aren't bad, but like I said, I don't want to be doing homework for the good bits. Not trying to be a cynical heartsuit, but I suppose I'm gonna be that one negative review in an overwhelmingly positive sea. Elden Ring is just worse than all 3 Dark Souls games. The only thing it does that Dark Souls doesn't is the open world, and while that is really nice at the beginning, it gets old pretty fast, but the biggest problem of Elden Ring are its bosses. There are only like 5 unique bosses, the rest gets used over and over and over in various gank setups in the increasingly heartsuit caves as the game goes on. And the worst part is, even the unique bosses aren't that good. FromSoft said they want to make the game more accessible and lower the requirements on Coop, and it shows. It shows so badly. Most bosses just attack non-stop, or teleport around their arenas, so you either summon help or you use one of the broken builds and just trade hits with them. The boss design is just so boring. For the last few achievements, I just used the Mimic tier summon and went like 50 levels higher than I originally planned just to finally get it over with. Closing thoughts, Elden Ring is a huge disappointment. Most of the time you'll feel like a DS2 remake with the amount of heartsuit reskin gank bosses, and the few main bosses are very poorly designed. The open world is nice, but gets old relatively fast, and very early into the game you'll just ride by everything. It doesn't matter what I think of Elden Ring. This game sold over 20 million copies in a year. In the era of games as live service, it demonstrated that an incredibly difficult single-player experience can be a blockbuster. It's FromSoft's biggest hit and has cemented them as one of the most iconic developers of all time. The world has spoken, this game is great. The fact that I didn't like it very much is totally irrelevant. But I value honesty in review, and in this case being honest means going against the grain. That's kind of daunting as a reviewer. Who among you is brave enough to critique the Mona Lisa, or Taylor Swift's latest album? These sorts of juggernauts are hard to approach, but I've summoned up my courage, and I'm ready to be a contrarian. My first complaint is the switch to open world. The Dark Souls games are a series of branching corridors, with paths opening or closing dynamically. There's a real sense of momentum pushing you forward from bonfire to bonfire, delving ever deeper into your own personal quest. It sets a mood both claustrophobic and expansive. Elden Ring, by contrast, feels too large. Simply following the critical path will get you maimed, so you're encouraged to spend a lot of time just wandering around the landscape. It's a beautiful landscape to be sure, but there's altogether too little happening in most of it. Liurnia in particular is a dull slog, but all of the areas suffer from a design that emphasizes scenery over a sense of flow. Speaking of a sense of flow, bosses also feel like a downgrade from previous titles. The core of the combat in these games is learning the attack patterns of your opponents. Starting with Sekiro, the design became a bit more meta. As we predict the bosses, the designers predict us right back. Things like, to use examples from the game, a stomp attack having a little leg hitch to draw out the animation unexpectedly, or a sword swing that is actually a bluff for a downward slam. These little bait animations ruin the fun. Dark Souls felt good because the demon lifted his club to strike, you guessed the timing, and the demon missed you. Elden Ring, by contrast, will make the timing janky just to catch you. It moves the combat away from visual prediction and towards rote memorization, which lessens it. All of this could be easily forgiven if the story was gripping, and I was very optimistic on this front, considering George R.R. Martin's involvement. Sadly, the story is garbage, told poorly, and you know this to be true, because you watched a YouTube video in order to understand it, rather than go through the torture of trying to learn the lore through gameplay. Understanding the story is hours of disjointed investigative work, struggling through side quests that become uncompletable at a slight breeze and reading item descriptions for insufferably vague context clues. If it wasn't for Vatividya and his ilk, we'd all be completely lost. That's simply poor storytelling. It all felt like vague illusion for the sake of vague illusion. So much was left open to interpretation that the line between loose end and plot hole feels very blurred, which fundamentally weakens the narrative. Nobody's motives are explicable and thus nobody's motives are interesting. Elden Ring honestly just feels like a Dark Souls knockoff. One could argue that Bloodborne and Sekiro were the same, but to me, they felt like interesting and compelling innovations on the core mechanics established in Demon Souls. Elden Ring didn't innovate. It just slapped on a coat of paint, went open world, and called it a day. Souls became Grace, Lords of Cinder became Rune Bearers, and mechanics were almost entirely rehashed from old titles. Boring. Ultimately, none of my complaints are important. 20 million copies, remember? This review is going to get drowned out by positive reviews from people who had a great 150 hours with this game, and honestly, that's probably for the best. There's clearly something really special here that a lot of people love, and that should be celebrated. But as a FromSoft fan, as an RPG fan, and as a fan of challenging combat games in general, I was left disappointed by Elden Ring. After an hour of research trying to get widescreen working, I've learned that you can get banned for a widescreen fix. Why? I don't understand why one dude by himself can fix it, but the developer can't just implement it into the game. It's sold well over 20 million units. That's $1.2 billion. You make $1 billion but don't support widescreen, you lock the FPS to 60, the frame time is busted and HDR doesn't work. And they know about all of this. They just shrug their shoulders and choose not to fix any of it. And when one guy fixes all of it for them, they'll ban you for enabling those fixes. There are workarounds for the anti-cheat, but it's hard to know if it works or not because every time there's an update, it breaks it. So you gotta roll the dice? Cross your fingers? WTF? I realize that most people laugh and say, don't buy a widescreen monitor. Why though? I've spent thousands of dollars for a premium experience and they've turned my PC into a console for no reason at all. What's far worse is them saying, some nice fellow did our job for us and fixed everything, but we'll ban you for using those fixes. I refuse to reward this kind of carelessness when they're sitting on there at seas with $1 billion in the bank.